I was one of the Native American children, adopted at birth and removed from our country's Indian reservation system. I was raised in a small middle-class farming community, but was never told of my true American Indian heritage. It was still taboo back in those early days. The years passed, and in 1987 I lost both parents. While going through their personal belongings, my wife discovered my adoption papers and she began a search. 5 years later, I was reunited with my biological Lakota family, living on the lower Brulé Sioux Indian Reservation of South Dakota. I am a son of two mothers and a product of two worlds that had collided, but I have an equal amount of love and pride for both. I'm Paul LaRoche, and the stories you are about to see are an attempt to share this true American story of a hidden heritage. Well, thank you for joining us on Hidden Heritage. I have a special guest with me here today. I will introduce her in just a minute, but I'd like to explain that this episode is going to cover a couple different topics. You've heard my introduction on almost every podcast so far, and I tell our little story about reunion, about how I was adopted at birth and found my family late in life. And I've had so many people ask about that. It's really like music was just a part of our journey and has been. It still continues to be part of that journey. But there's a couple of factors. One of them is, the history of the music part of it. And I certainly mentioned that I was an adopted person. So the adoption story is been as fascinating to some people as the music itself. Now, as I've traveled over the course of the last 30 years, I've run into a significant number of people who have an experience with adoption. Either they're adoptees or they're a family that's made an adoption, that has adopted a young child. And so their stories are interesting. I wish I would have captured some of those. The one thing I've learned is that there's no two stories when it comes to the adoption process that are the same. They're all different. Some have a positive outcome and some don't. So it's just the way life goes. So I'm going to title this podcast, I'm going to call it The Lost Birds. And that title itself comes from a Lakota perspective. There were so many Native children that were adopted out back in the early days of moving in the tribes into the reservations that they were lost. Many of them were lost, but some found their way back into their families and back into the culture, and they gave those that returned the name of the Lost Birds. And so with that being said, I have a guest with me here today who's got quite an adoption story herself. And this is going to probably be one of those stories that you would never guess because everyone's different. But before we start, I'm going to ask her to introduce herself. And after that, just tell us a little bit about your current activities and what you do these days. And we'll go back into the older part after a while. So that being said, here we go, our special guest.
Fantastic. My name is Tammy Makram, and I actually grew up in Southwest Minnesota, and in the most recent years, for about the last 10 years, I have been the managing director for the Memorial Auditorium Performing Arts Center in Worthington, Minnesota. And it's been an absolutely amazing experience. Kind of a one-man show, one-woman show, I guess I should say. And that means I run the building itself, but also go out and find entertainment and talent and all different kinds of shows and experiences for the people who come to Memorial Auditorium Performing Arts Center. I also feel like it's one of my missions to work as much as possible with the children and young people of our area and to give them experiences with live performances. And also a part of my job is that the students from our local school district use our Performing Arts Center as a place to perform. So we have their choirs and bands and symphony orchestras and their theater department that all perform at Memorial Auditorium Performing Arts Center as well.
We're talking about the performing arts from my hometown of Worthington. And I have done a couple of previous stories and podcasts about growing up in Worthington. And of course, this is a part of that. And I recall, and Tammy, you might know this, maybe not, but when I was in my younger day, junior high age, the Performing Arts Center that you just spoke about was part of the junior high, was part of the actually high school. It was junior high and high school combined. And I'm sure there's some listeners out there that recall that. One of the really cool things for somebody in my or our generation that is in music is that they'll remember that what is the auditorium nowadays was actually the gymnasium on the junior high side. So, when it comes to talking about Worthington, it really has been one of Worthington's assets for a long time. Now, when I was younger, there wasn't really much of a performing arts program. And somewhere along the line, the city invested in that. And Tammy, do you know about when, I don't mean to catch you by surprise here, but if you were to take a guess, when did the auditorium officially become the Worthington Memorial Auditorium?
I think it was in the 90s, sometime in the 90s that happened. What I know is that it was the entire building at one time was scheduled to be torn down.
Right, I remember that.
And luckily for all of us, some people got together and decided that they were going to save the piece of the auditorium that was for performances, that was the stage, that was the gymnasium, and so on. So that the rest of the classrooms and so on, those things were torn down, but they saved that building, that piece of the building. And then it started to turn into a place for performances. And then just before I came on board, which was, I believe about 12 years ago, is when they decided to raise money and make some improvements to the Performing Arts Center. And what they did at that time was add in an air conditioning system, which I'm sure was really appreciated. And they also added on a piece that is now the new lobby area of the building as well. So, yeah, fortunately, there were some people that had the foresight to decide to save that building. And then it also made it so that the high school and middle school are able to come and perform there as well.
It's really a wonderful facility, and it's kind of put Worthington on the map once again, because we're now part of the performing arts world, of which you know a lot of. You travel around to different venues all over the area.
I do.
One of the things that I don't know if I've mentioned this previously or not, but we've performed at the Memorial Auditorium several times over the past years. And every time we'd have one of those performances, it takes me back a little bit. There's a little kind of a reminiscing thing that happens to me that puts you in such a good mood. Because this is what I remember, that the auditorium, the performance floor on the auditorium was actually part of the gymnasium from the junior high.
It was.
And we used to perform. We actually did things back on that stage floor back in, I'm going back to like 1969, 70, 71, 72. And I recall a talent contest that we were participants in, and it was on that stage. And so that place has always had a place in my heart. And of course, I was so pleased to see that they were able to preserve that and carry it on. So when you're talking about Worthington, there's a lot of people in our generations that will remember that auditorium as the gymnasium for the old junior high. Mm-hmm. But it's advanced and it's doing very well. And, Tammy, you've had a chance to go around to other theaters within the area. We don't need to pinpoint them all, but so how does our auditorium stack up to other performing arts areas around the area?
Really, we are, I think, a top-notch. Of course, I'm a little biased, but we have made so many wonderful improvements, especially in the last 10 years. We have been able to put in entirely a new sound system, new lighting system, new seating in the auditorium, a lot of things that really brought us up to speed with top caliber performing arts centers, so that when we want to bring in talent, we can seek out from a broader base of people coming in because we have what it takes to put on the show. And I think when performers do come in, they're very pleasantly surprised. And the other thing that I think is really fun that I hear so many times is it's kind of a unique seating arrangement where the balcony comes forward and is quite close to the stage. So for the people that are sitting in the audience and enjoying the performance, they feel like they're very close and it's a very intimate setting. And it really is the same for the people that are on the stage performing. They feel like the audience is right there.
Awesome.
And I think it makes for a really fun setting to do performances. Also, I wanted to tell you when you were talking about talent show, I don't think I've ever shared this with you before, but when I was young, about 6 and 7 years old, my little brother and I used to sing, and we would go around to talent contests and sing.
No kidding.
And I actually have a picture of the two of us performing for Turkey Day's talent contest.
I remember those.
On that stage, and we're dressed in little cowboy outfits, and we sang the song Buttons and Bows.
Hey.
So I think we got second place. So it's kind of interesting how things come around, and now I'm running the building.
Yeah, it must be kind of special to be the director there when you, as a young person, were a performer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Listen, Tammy, we're going to take a short pause right here. We'll come back with another chapter here. We've been speaking with Tammy Makram here today, who's the director of the Worthington Memorial Auditorium, Performing Arts Center. And what a beautiful asset it's been to Worthington. And Tammy, I believe that you spent some of your years in Laverne, didn't you? Have I got that correct?
I did. I was the director of the Palace Theater in Laverne for a while.
Yeah.
And that was also a really fun experience. The Palace Theater was built in 1914 and is a beautiful historic theater. It started out as a vaudeville theater, and I've really had a fun time doing performances there as well, bringing in performers, and they have a little bit of everything there, just like we do in Worthington.
Well, the reason I wanted to mention that is because, you've been in the world of performing arts for quite some time. I have previously interviewed some other people from the Laverne area. I've talked to Jim Brandenburg. I've talked to Bill Keitel, who is, of course, from Laverne, one of my old musician buddies. So we've got quite a group of people that have stayed in the area as far as the arts go. Now, allow me to kind of go on a little bit different angle here, if I can. So obviously, Tammy and I have got a common denominator in the world of music and the arts, but I had a chance to catch part of your story years ago. Once again, at the beginning of every episode, I play a little 1-minute trailer that talks about I was one of the Native American children adopted at birth. And that's been a very important thing to the evolution of Brulé. And I tell the story every performance, and there's always a number of people that respond. And so I realize that these adoption stories, they change, and there's so many different outcomes of them. And so I know, Tammy, that you've got kind of an unusual, how can I put this, a very interesting story about your process of adoption. So I'm going to just turn this over to you right now, and you can start at what point you want to.
Sure. What's really interesting is my job at the Memorial Auditorium Performing Arts Center is really what led me to find my family. And that happened because the editor of the Worthington Daily Globe, when I started my job, came to interview me about being the new managing director at Memorial Auditorium. And after we were done talking about that, we were talking a little bit about my search for my birth family and my unique story of the beginning of my life.
Absolutely.
And it was Julie Bunger, who is still the editor of the paper. And Julie said to me, I would really love to come back in December and do the rest of, another story on your adoption. And so she did that. And because of her story, she wrote a story where I told her about how when I was about 32 or 34, something like that, I had started to do my search for my birth family. And that at the time, Unsolved Mysteries, which was a big TV show at the time, I had tried to get onto Unsolved Mysteries at that time and was unable to reach out to them or get them to do my story. And when she included the name Unsolved Mysteries in her story in the newspaper, it flagged Unsolved Mysteries. And then they reached out to me and said, we'd like to do your story now. So 10 years ago, or just about 10 years ago, they interviewed me and I did a story for Unsolved Mysteries about my story. And because of that, someone told me about 23andMe, the DNA website, and then it was a roller coaster ride from there. But to back up a little bit, when I first started searching, when I was in my early 30s, all I had to go from was a very small piece of paper from a newspaper that said, if you've been following the story of baby Jane Doe, who was left on the doorstep of Miller Hospital on Christmas Eve, and this was in 1961, she was adopted by a family in rural Minnesota. That's what I had. And so I took that little clipping and I went to talk to someone at the St. Paul Pioneer Press. And that gentleman said, we don't have archives in our building that go back to 1961. So what you have to do is go to the Minnesota Historical Society or the Minnesota History Center, and they can help you find newspapers back then. So I went to the Minnesota History Center library, and I told the gentleman what I was looking for, and he rolled out a cart of microfiche,
wow,
which is what everything was on, and said there were 4 newspapers back at that time. There was a morning and evening paper in Minneapolis, and there was a morning and evening paper in St. Paul. So all you can do is put on a roll of microfiche, and you're just going to have to look page by page and see what you find. So quite honestly, it seemed like a huge daunting task because there were stacks of these rolls of microfiche on this cart, probably 100 of them, I would guess. I took the first one and I had him help me put the reel on the microfiche reader. I pressed on the button to scan through the pages, and I let go of the button, and right in front of me on the screen was a picture of a nurse holding me.
Wow.
And it was on the front page of the paper.
Oh my gosh.
So it was almost it was surreal because for one thing, I hadn't seen any pictures of myself as a baby.
Right.
And to find it like that. And what happened is because I was left on Christmas Eve, this was the front page story of all the newspapers on Christmas Day.
I thought I'd just ask you and clarify this. You said baby Jane Doe?
Yeah.
That was you?
Baby Jane Doe was me.
But you didn't know at that time until
No.
Wow.
Yeah. Because, of course, they didn't.
Right.
That's just what they called a baby that had been left.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's this big picture of a nurse holding me in her arms, and underneath it said, baby Jane Doe was left on the doorstep of Miller Hospital on Christmas Eve. She's fine. We're hoping that maybe someone will come forward to claim her or tell us, what her story is. And then I found out that, again, I started looking through more pages, and there are many, many stories and many pictures in all these different newspapers. So I made copies of everything. What I ended up finding out, of course, was that no one ever did come forward.
Right.
They had a lot of people call that wanted to adopt me. They had a lot of letters and things like that. So that was interesting. So I made copies of everything, and I went back to the reporter at the Pioneer Press, which, by the way, was interesting because he himself had adopted children. So he really took a personal interest in the story. And the other interesting part of the story is that they talked about this couple who had been there that night at the hospital, gotten out of their car, and they could hear a baby crying. And they thought someone had left a baby in the car, so they were looking in all these different cars, couldn't find where the cry was coming from, and had almost given up. And then they went around the side of the hospital entrance. There was a little side door for kind of a staff entrance that had a little canopy over it. And there was this cardboard box with a newspaper over top of it. And they lifted up the newspaper and found me.
Wow.
And brought me inside. And they were there actually to visit their first grandbaby that had been born that day. So they weren't really expecting to find a baby in a box, but that's what they found. Thank goodness. And that's kind of an interesting story that there's another little piece to. But anyway, I took the story back to the reporter, and he then made it into a story for the Pioneer Press. And after that, the Star Tribune also picked up the story. And then some Sioux Falls newspapers and TV stations picked it up as well. And I, was hoping to learn something, from someone who knew who had left me at that time. I got so many cards and letters from people, but they were mostly a lot of them were from mothers who had given up babies at that time and how different a time it was then.
Right.
They said it's very possible that this person never told anyone what happened, and so you might not hear from them. But anyway, so of course, eventually I was adopted by my family, Gert and Stan Wessels, and they were farming by Ellsworth, Minnesota, and they adopted 3 more children after me, and that's where I grew up. And so that's what happened in my initial search, was finding that.
Right. Now, can I ask you a question
Sure.
before you want? I want you to get the rest of this out.
Sure.
So I'm just curious now, your adoptive parents, how old were you when they adopted you?
I was 4 months old.
Okay, so you were so that it was the baby in the box that was held by some members of the church that took you in?
That found me?
That found you?
They took me into the hospital.
In the hospital.
And actually, I had to be warmed up because it was Christmas Eve and it was cold and snowing. And so the hospital first took care of me. And then the county, I would guess it is, gave custody of me to the Children's Home Society adoption agency. I went into their orphanage for a while.
Okay.
And then was placed into a foster home.
I got you. So the baby in the box was discovered by this elderly couple.
Mm-hmm.
They set it up so you were able to be moved into some sort of you mentioned the hospital, but I'm sure they had to check you out and make sure everything was okay.
Yes, yeah.
But eventually then you were picked up and adopted through the adoption process.
By my family here in Southwest Minnesota.
Were you in the orphanage at that time?
I was in a foster home by then.
A foster home. Very long in the foster home?
I'm not sure how long I was in the foster home. What I do know that's kind of interesting is this was the winter of 61, 62, when we got probably more snow than we've ever gotten.
Yeah.
And so even though my parents knew that the adoption agency had a baby for them in St. Paul, they couldn't get there because there was so much snow. They couldn't get out to get on the roads to get to the Twin Cities. So it took a little extra time before they were able to get up there to actually
That's an incredible,
do the adoption.
an incredible thing that happened to you. I mean, I've heard a lot of stories, but that one's pretty unique. I'm just curious because, from that point on, our lives are kind of similar. Did your adoptive parents, how much information did they give you about your adoption?
They always told us, myself and my siblings, that we were adopted from even before we could really understand what that meant.
Yeah.
And so we just never, it was just a part of who we were. We never really thought about it a lot.
I understand that.
And as it turned out, I ended up having some adopted cousins as well. So that all was just a part of our lives and we didn't think a whole lot about it. But I guess it was a little different for me because at least my siblings, they had some information about who the biological families were.
Right.
But in my case, there was nothing.
Zero.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So I'm going to here, you are now living around Ellsworth, Minnesota, correct? In the rural part of that community.
Yep.
And you're growing up there.
Growing up there.
Tell me a little bit about how you recall the early years and being an adopted child. Just how did that work going through your early days probably up through your teens?
It was interesting because I grew up on a farm and I loved the farm. I loved some things about the farm, but I always also never really felt quite like I was a farm girl, maybe.
I can understand that too.
And so there were a lot of things when you're adopted, I think, that you wonder, like, who am I? What are these pieces of myself that I don't really understand? And is that coming from my biological family, or is it just normal? Some of it I'm sure is just normal questions kids have as they're growing up. But
how did you feel towards this is something that I'm curious about. I asked this question quite a bit. In my case, as I was growing up, I had this thing where I just considered my adoptive parents my mom and dad. No questions asked.
Oh,
it's just
absolutely.
like that's what it is, and I'm comfortable with that. So how'd that work for you?
That was the same for me.
Thing?
My mom and dad were my mom and dad.
Gotcha.
And they still are. That's my mom and dad.
Well, the reason I ask is because a lot of these days, everybody, in my case too, the term adoptive parents gets thrown out along with biological parents now and years later. And it's like the two are, it gets you thinking a little bit, but
it does.
It always was uncomfortable for me to think about a biological family because I felt it would disrupt my adopted family. It's just, that's what happened to me. But these days it's so different. It's what I call, the adoption seems like it's more of an open process.
It is.
Isn't it?
Which I think is a good thing.
I do too.
And, it's interesting too, because I ended up becoming a social worker. That was actually my first career. And a part of what I did was child protection, and I worked with some adoption situations. And I think I brought a different perspective to that, being adopted myself, in that I think I felt it was important to have that openness if it was at all possible. Of course, you don't want to do it if there's going to be some harm to the children. But if you can at least let the biological parents have some idea of how the child that they gave up is doing.
Right.
And if there are questions that the child has, to be able to answer those. And again, to be able to do it without doing any harm. I think that is really the best way to be able to do things.
Cool. I'm here with Tammy Makram, and we're talking about the adoption process. And I've titled this episode, The Lost Birds. I think Tammy fits that description to the T. And so I'm going to ask you a question that kind of jumps into your story at the midpoint. So you were found as a baby, discovered by a couple, adopted, raised by what I always consider, you probably do too, two wonderful parents. Somewhere along the way, Tammy, there was a discovery or something took place for you to make that connection back to your origins. And I don't think I know sitting here right now. So let's just jump in right there.
Okay.
Tell me what happened.
Okay. So as I mentioned before, Unsolved Mysteries did the story. And one of the things that came of that was someone wrote to me and said, you should, because you are an abandoned baby and don't have any kind of information, you should put your DNA on a DNA database, because that's what I did, and I was able to find my family that way. And this is way back. I mean, we're talking 10 years ago when 23andMe and Ancestry and so on were really just starting to do these things.
That's right.
And so I hadn't even heard of it before. I have to do what? Spit in a tube and send it in, and somehow that's going to tie me to people? That just seemed kind of bizarre, but okay. So I actually started out with Ancestry and did just that. Spit in a little tube in their kit and sent it off FedEx and waited to see what happened. It was quite interesting when I was able to gain the results of that. Initially, I found a few very distant relatives, like sixth cousins or fifth cousins, things like that.
Right.
And that was a great experience initially because I hadn't ever had any connection with anyone before. But the other super interesting fact that came about because of that was that I learned my cultural or ethnic makeup.
Exactly.
And it turned out that I was, I think, 98.7% Ashkenazi Jew. Yeah.
And you hadn't a clue about that,
I didn't
right?
even know what that meant exactly. I mean, I grew up in Southwest Minnesota. I had maybe known one Jewish person.
Right.
And he was a teacher of mine. His name was Maury Rabinowitz. I came to learn later that he actually told my parents that he thought I was Jewish because of my looks. But I didn't know that. They never told me that until this whole thing happened. So that's kind of interesting. But anyway, that was a very big moment, and I had to go and find out what does that mean. I didn't know there were really two different kinds of Jewish tribes, and to learn a little bit about that. And so, yes, very interesting thing to find out. And then from there, I started reaching out to some of these cousins that I was linked with. And really what I would say is, so here's what I know. I know I was left in a cardboard box on the doorstep of a hospital in St. Paul, December 31st, 1961. Do you have any knowledge of anyone that might have had a pregnancy that, I didn't even know where to begin, but I just started reaching out to people. And I didn't hear from anyone really that said that they could help, even though some very nice people did take the time to write back. But so it was initially very exciting, and then it became almost disappointing because it was like, okay, I finally have this, but now it's going nowhere. It's not helping me to find my birth mother, which is really who I was looking for. Because in my mind, being a mom myself, I thought, wow, you make this decision to take your baby and leave it at on a hospital doorstep and then never know what happened to it. And I think it's the ultimate sacrifice to do something like that. If you're in a situation and you don't know what to do, and so you're literally taking your child somewhere and with the hope that the right person will find that baby and, that it will be a good choice or something good for that child. And so I wanted to find her and tell her, thank you for doing that, for putting me somewhere where people could find me. And also, I had this great life because you did that. Yeah. I had wonderful adoptive people who took me in and took care of me. So, I wanted to find her and tell her that. And I was just thinking, please let me find some link to her. I also, of course, left information with the Children's Home Society that if she should ever decide to reach out, they were kind of filtering things for me. And anyway, so this went on for a little while through Ancestry that I was waiting and hoping to be contacted, but didn't hear anything. So after a while, I didn't look very often. I just occasionally would go back and see if I'd had any new messages. And then I think it was about 6 months later, in August of 2015, that I looked back and there was a message there. And the message said that my name is Abby Green, and I read about your story, and we are connected, and I think I'm your sister.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
where did that take you on the search?
Under my desk, initially, curled up in a ball under my desk.
Sure. No, I understand.
I was not thinking about siblings at all. So that was pretty crazy. And I thought, wow, I have to think about this a little bit.
Right.
And then she had given me her phone number and said, here's my number. I would love to hear from you. And it took me a little while. I think I called every one of my friends and said, this just happened, and I'm not sure what to do about this next step. I know I need to do it, but yeah. So I just needed a little support, a little bit of time. And then I made the phone call to what it turned out to be my oldest sister, Abby. And she answered the phone, and I said who I was. And she said, I'm so glad you called. Welcome to our family.
Man, oh man. I'm just super curious today. I don't want to interrupt your story. I'm just super curious. How did she, you gotta tell us, how did she know that she was related to you?
She had been on this road for quite a while herself.
Yeah.
She's 13 years older than me. And so she was actually the first child that our birth mother gave up for adoption.
Oh.
And she gave her up in a very traditional way, but also to Children's Home Society. And so she had more than she had information as to who our birth mother was. She didn't, I'm sorry, she didn't have that information, but the adoption agency had that information.
Okay. I got that.
So she had left a message for our birth mother at the adoption agency and said, I'm your daughter. I hope you'll contact me, and left her contact information. And as it turned out, our birth mother didn't contact her, but another sister, another sibling did. She came along looking also for our birth mother and found Abby's information which Abby had given permission to give it out. And so then this sister contacted Abby and said, I went looking for my birth mother and found out that we share the same birth mother.
Wow.
And then from there, they ended up somehow figuring out who our birth mother was. It wasn't through the adoption agency, but somehow they learned it. And they approached our birth mother and did it kind of in an interesting way. They delivered flowers to her and left a note and said who they were and how to contact them.
And that was a good way to make that first move.
Right, because then it was in her court. The ball was in her court as to what to do about it.
That's interesting. I'm glad that you shared that, because that's a big thing that I've come across when you start to make the discovery.
Yes.
Because you and I have our own perspective on this. There's obviously something took place on the other side from the mother that created that scenario.
Right, exactly. And anyway, so they were able to connect with her and meet her. And anyway, so that started things for that piece of the puzzle fitting together. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until, a few years down the road when these DNA sites came on. And what they found out was that they had different birth fathers. Mm-hmm. So even though Abby had found her birth mother, she was still looking for her birth father. Yeah. And so she had put her DNA on since she didn't find him through Ancestry, she moved to 23andMe to see if maybe she would make a connection there, as did our other sister. And that's where things got interesting because another sister who was abandoned like me 4 years after me had her DNA on 23andMe.
So let me get this straight. So you were a baby in a box.
Yes.
You found another sibling that was adopted traditionally.
Yes.
And that there's another sibling that kind of went through the same thing you did in terms of...
Well, the sister she found was also traditionally adopted.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So that's how they found each other, because they both ended up in our birth mother's file at that adoption agency.
But by now, you got to be thinking, well, how come I ended up in a box?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just...
And to be honest, that is something I still don't know.
You know what? Good for you, because in our adoption world, the things that took place, we got to a certain point on the information part, kind of like you did. Mm-hmm. And what happened to Kathy and I was that we finally just said, we've got enough, we have enough information. And we're comfortable with that. There's still some missing pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah.
But if we don't ever make that connection, I'd still be fine. And that took quite a bit to get to that point. But you had to go through that process as well. I'm here with Tammy Makram. She's telling us about her story of adoption, and a very fascinating story. I of all the stories I've heard, I think yours is quite unique. You found siblings eventually, and you're communicating with them. Let's just jump in here at some point. You can pick a year if you want to, but at some point you started to get together with your siblings.
Yes. So
I'm going to give it to you from right there.
Thanks. So what I found out is that I had 3 sisters. I have to think about it a little bit.
Yeah.
I have 3 sisters that I have the same birth mother with. And then I have 5 other siblings that were through my birth father, but they had a different mother.
Wow.
And so
you got a big family out there.
I do. I went from having 4 or 3 siblings in my adoptive family to adding 9 more people. And it was a lot.
What did it take for you to physically get together with your siblings.
Well, that's interesting. It actually was, we decided that we should have a kind of a family reunion,
Sure.
but it was the first time that we met each other. And we did that at someone's home that graciously let us use her home in St. Paul. And we invited, obviously, people from both our adoptive families and our biological families. And it included siblings and cousins and friends and all different kinds of people. I think there were probably 40 to 50 people that showed up for this event.
The tone of your voice and look on your face tells me that it was a wonderful reunion.
It was.
Okay.
It was unbelievable. And so much joy. And, because I think in my case, or in our case, we felt very welcomed. And I don't know that is always the case.
It's not. I can tell you.
Yeah.
It's not. That's why I say some of these stories that have the positive outcome of which we're kind of speaking on here today, it doesn't always happen that way.
Right. I think part of it had to do with the people themselves and how open they were to this. The other part is being older. We're in our 50s and 60s.
I thought about that many times. Imagine if we tried to get this information back when we were just young teenagers.
Oh.
I've always said, and I don't know, I've asked other people about this. In my case, I wouldn't have processed the information quite the same as I did when I was older and it actually occurred. I was 38 at the time when the discovery started happening. Mm-hmm. And that was still early. And I look back now, it was early in this whole process. I don't know what I would have done
because
in my
it
teens.
Changes your identity.
It does. I always like to say almost in a split second, you go through, this term sounds funny, but I use it a lot because you go through this paradigm shift because you now have to look at your life a little different. It's not the same as it was. In my case, there was a 180-degree part of that. So that 180-degree flip is a total reversal of kind of some of the stuff that you've been programmed with.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and I don't hear everybody say that, but I'm glad to hear that it was a shift, a paradigm shift that took place, and it had a positive outcome for you.
Yes. Yeah. I feel very fortunate. I think that then what has happened since that time is just everyone's spread out all over the United States. So it's been a matter of going and visiting and meeting people. And that's been really fun. And just to hear family stories and develop some of that as a part of who I am.
Yeah.
And then, there is another whole piece too, where we did, when we found this out, our birth parents were still living. Mm-hmm. And so we got to go and meet them and spend some time getting to know them a little bit.
Now, hold it a second.
Yeah.
So did you say that your birth parents?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So you actually made that connection and were able to meet them?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. They were living in Tucson, Arizona.
What was that like?
Very surreal. Very surreal. Went there again.
Would you do it all over? Would you do it again, Tammy?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I talked about before, there was that piece of being able to say thank you, but also maybe hopefully give them some peace of mind.
Some closure.
Yeah, of here, we grew up in wonderful adoptive families that loved us and took care of us. And so you don't have to worry about that anymore. And it was, unfortunately, like our birth mother had some dementia going on. And,
right.
And I don't know how much of that maybe was just things that she had blocked out. And so what was real and what wasn't, probably lines were definitely crossed there, I would guess.
Well, it was surreal in the first place.
Yes.
And then you got that element.
Yes, to have, a 50-some-year-old person show up on your doorstep saying, I'm your daughter, is probably very strange.
Yeah.
But they were very sweet to us, and we never really were able, unfortunately, to obtain any more information.
I got it. I know you suggested that.
Which was,
enough.
How much do you need to go back into that?
Exactly. Yeah.
People do what they need to do in certain situations. As it turned out, the two of them, there's a whole different piece to what happened there.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, they loved each other, and they were together for about 38 years.
That's something.
Married to each other.
Yeah.
And so that actually was a pretty good thing to learn and find out.
Exactly.
And I hope that they were happy to have met us. And
I'm sure they were.
And do that.
Do you feel internally like you've completed, spiritually and physically and mentally, have you completed the quest to a point to where you're comfortable with it now?
Very much so.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is really interesting, the whole nature versus nurture part of that, and who you are. You would think that the majority of it would come from how, the people who raised you or where you were raised and those kinds of things. But there's a lot to do with genetics and DNA and what gets passed through that.
Yeah.
Even, I think we maybe talked a little bit about this, but even memories can be passed through DNA from one person to another.
Yeah.
So things that were maybe deja vu sort of things that I thought I was experiencing but didn't make sense to me were probably just something that got passed down to me that I was learning about. Yes.
How did you I wrote this down because I got to ask you. So what is you didn't tell me, but you have a birth date, right? You have a birthday. It comes every year. How did you determine where did you set the birth date at?
Here's what I think happened. My birth date on my birth certificate is December 14th, but I think that I was actually born on December 24th. I think it might have been a typo at the time, because I still had my umbilical cord when they found me. It was tied with a piece of string.
So you could make a rough guess at the exact date.
So it could have very well been that I was born on Christmas Eve.
Wow. Christmas Eve, baby in a box.
Yes.
That's just too wild.
Yes. And another really just a quick sidebar that of how interesting things happen, or things that seem like coincidences, but I don't know if they are. When one of the stories aired on WCCO up in the Twin Cities, a woman that was watching it happened to catch the story, and she was the woman who had the baby. Wow.
No, I go ahead. I knew this was going to be not a traumatic, but it's a soul opening.
It is
tale to tell.
It is.
Yeah. I've been right there.
She had the baby the day that I was found, and it was her parents coming to the hospital to see her baby.
Wow.
That evening, that found me and brought me inside. And so here she is watching my story on the news and is like, oh my gosh, that's the baby my parents found the day my son was born.
Huh.
And so she called the news station, and then actually Liz Cullen, who grew up in Worthington, so kind of another interesting tie-in, but Liz was working for WCCO at the time, so she had done the initial story, and she called and she said, I got a phone call from the woman whose parents found you. and we want to film you meeting them, her and her husband. And they set it up, and they filmed me coming up to the door and her opening the door. And you can imagine it was very emotional.
Oh, yeah.
So it was like, for them, it was 54 years later, they were finally meeting that baby that their parents had found, but they had never, because it all became confidential, there was no way for them to find out anything about me after that. And the other really crazy piece of this is that this lovely family, she made birthday cake for me.
Oh.
And so once we were done filming, we sat down and we were sitting around their table having some cake. And at the time we were talking, and they were also a Jewish couple. And she said, "Can you tell me what your birth parents' names were, so that we can see if we actually knew who they were?" Because, it's a pretty tight-knit community. And as it turned out, my birth mother's sister had been their next-door neighbor for many, many years.
Really?
Had sat at that very table and had meals, she and her family,
that is
with them. And she had unfortunately passed away about 6 months before I found everyone, so I never got to meet her. And so that happened. They knew her, and she was a good friend of theirs and their next door neighbor.
Tammy, let me throw this out, because I've kind of dealt with this issue a couple times. Now that you've told us that whole story, I'd like to get your opinion on a topic that you very seldom hear about. So here it is. So I've made a discovery, same as you, a different way, but I found my ancestry, my biological connection was American Indian. And I grew up without knowing that, just like you did. I was told I was French Canadian, so I had some identity. But here's what I'm going to get at. Because we human beings are very closely related, more than we even know. Stories like yours and ours remind people of that. And here's what I mean. Think about this. Now, I'm just going to tell you what happened to me. And if you want to just drop it or say something, you can. But so I made the discovery of being an American Indian. Now, when I grew up, there was a young boy in town, the only family in Worthington that was ever Native American. And the sad component in my story, which I'm trying to atone for ever since I found out about this, is I'm certain I was one of the children who gave that boy a hard time by saying, "Hey, Chief," all this kind of stuff. Would have been tough on that individual. And all of a sudden, boom, one day you find out that's who you are. And so what I'm going to ask you is, you told us that you have this Jewish ancestry. Today, with all these anti-Semitic things going on, what if, Tammy, what if in your earlier day you would have had some negative perspective on that culture? You maybe didn't. I'm just saying that it could have happened.
It could
And
have.
then one day you find out you're from that genetic background. It really causes a person to, hey, you better really think about who you are, how you treat other people, what you say, how you look at somebody. It really is kind of an interesting perspective on a human being.
Yeah.
Did it ever come up in your discovery anywhere?
Not necessarily that piece, but, one thing that was interesting to me was how, obviously you hear about the Holocaust and the things that happened there. And I was even thinking about how, not only did I survive being left on a doorstep, but my family, my biological family, survived that Holocaust by some of them making the choice to come to the United States instead of staying where they were, where they probably all would have been gone. And so that whole piece of it takes on a very different feeling. And so, yes, I mean, what's going on today, it's very interesting and very sad in a way, because I know, well, and there's another piece to this, in that I ended up being married to a Palestinian person.
I know that.
And I think maybe now that I look back at it, maybe I was attracted to him because he was Middle Eastern. I don't know.
Yeah.
So I have learned, of course, the whole Palestinian piece of things,
Sure.
and now the Jewish side of things. And what I know of all of this is that for the most part, like you talk about when you give your message during the Brulé shows, is we are all one. And from the people that I've talked to that are Palestinian families and the Jewish people, the Jewish families and people that I've talked to, we are all just people. We're all like, for the most part, and even the people that lived there, they all get along really just fine. They just want their kids to grow up and have the best lives they can and spend time with their families. And it's these people that are causing the problems that really don't care about the general population of people. They're just doing whatever they want to do to try to make money, or whatever it is that they're getting out of it has nothing to do with the everyday people like you and I. And so hopefully you talk a lot about reconciliation.
I was just going to say that.
That's what needs to be happening now, is people need to hear each other's stories and learn that they're so much the same.
Because when you tell a story, Tammy, just like and I think I usually speak for myself, but in just this little thing here today, this kind of represents the two of us. But I have a little thing I always say that goes like this, that I'm the son of two mothers. I'm a product of two worlds that have collided and clashed over the years. And as a product of both, I have an affinity and a love for both sides. And so in that scenario, you and I and others become a little bit stronger advocates for what we call reconciliation.
Absolutely.
Because we are on both sides. And in my case, I like to say it was equal, right down the middle. Mm-hmm. And so that's something that is part of your life mission now. And I see you doing it.
So.
I see you doing it. I see that reconciliation process coming out. And we're in a very unique group of people.
We are.
Rare.
Where we are here is an amazing place to start with all of that.
Well,
and, we haven't really talked about the project last year where we brought Brulé in and did 6 performances and brought all the children in from our entire school district, which are children from so many different cultures, and how important it was to get that message to them.
Well, you know what, Tammy? I just realized this today after our conversation that wouldn't have happened. That whole little experience with all these kids in Worthington wouldn't have happened without your perspective on it and without our perspective on it.
Yes.
It took 2 people from 4 different parts of life. You had 2 worlds, I've had 2 worlds. Mm. We both have shared that common ground in the middle. And I think that's what made that event happen. So I have every bit of confidence in the world that that'll roll out in some fashion to do some good. And maybe kind of in conclusion here, this has been just fascinating. And I thank you so much for sharing that. The one thing that I like to leave with is, I've shared it with you many times. You already brought it up, but ironically, the Native American culture, the Lakota culture, has this little philosophy in life. And it's summed up in a word. It's Patakawee Oyasin. And it sounds kind of neat, but when you find out the translation, it just simply means that we are all related. And the other extension to that is we are related to all things. So not only are as humans connected, we're connected to the things around us that are natural too. The air we breathe and the trees and things like that. They're all part of whom we are. And we represent that in a dramatic way because of our unusual life stories. But the message and the mission remains the same. So what I'm going to do here is thank you for the conversation and give you the encouragement to continue to use that life story to do something really good in the world. And I can tell you for a fact, I suppose have observed our career. I've observed yours. Mm-hmm. So you're doing some great things, not only for this community, for this area, but for the arts world in general.
Thank you.
And we'll do the best on our side. And together, I think we can make a pretty good dent.
Perfect.
Thanks, Tammy.